Well, good morning, everybody. It's a beautiful day outside. It's a good day to go ice fishing and other things. It's freezing outside. I hope everybody is safe and warm. I know that the Metro Overflow shelter is open. It was open last night. It should be open tonight. I think it's going to be open for several nights now because it's so cold outside. I don't know when this cold spell is going to end, but hopefully sometime soon. But anyway, we're going to talk about something that goes on inside, and that's basketball and writing. Andrew Maraniss is our guest. He is the author of Strong Inside. It's the story about Percy Wallace. And we just thought it was a good time to bring Andrew on. He's probably got a number of upcoming projects that he's going to maybe tell us what he's doing. And we can talk about being an author to a book, and also what it means, particularly in Tennessee right now with some books being banned. So a lot of interesting things we'll talk about today. Andrew, always when we get started, I usually ask you something irrelevant. And I was looking at that baseball picture to your right. What is that?
Well, thanks for having me on, Jim. And that picture is the all-time team of the Milwaukee Brewers, which is my favorite baseball team from their 25th anniversary, which was in 1995. I bought it and it cost about as much money as I was making per month in 1995. I was 25 years old, right out of school pretty much. But I was born in Wisconsin. I grew up in Washington, D.C., but my grandparents were always back in Milwaukee, others set in Madison, and their way of keeping me connected to where I was from was through the team. So my grandfather subscribed me to a newsletter called Packer Report and another called What's Brewing, which was the Brewers newsletter. And I was obsessed with that team. I think I spent my entire middle school years just sitting drawing the Brewers logo in my notebook every day. And so that's what that is up there. It's mostly it's the all-time team as voted on by the fans in 95. Almost everybody on that picture is from the 1982 team that went to the World Series and lost to the Cardinals, and I cried.
Well, unfortunately, this interview is going to have to stop because I don't like the Brewers. I'm a big Cincinnati Reds fan.
Okay.
And, so I root against the Brewers at all costs.
Yeah, I understand.
So, anyways, nice having you on the show. Have a nice
fun.
day.
I'll see you tonight at the Vandy game.
Oh, no, the Brewers have been very worthy advocates these last several years. And actually, they're really good. I watched them play the Reds. Last year, it was, for those of you who keep up with the baseball and maybe the Reds and the Brewers, there was a series, I think it was maybe right before the All-Star game and then right after the All-Star game, yes, where the Reds were making some progress in terms of catching the Brewers. And this was supposed to be the great series. And I think the Brewers swept the Reds and the rest of the season fell apart. So anyway, so disappointed. I was so mad when that was going on. But yeah,
I'm trying to brainwash my kids now. I have an 11-year-old daughter, 8-year-old son. They're Brewers fans, but one of my wife and I, our missions before both of the kids are out of the house is to get them to every major league stadium. So in the summers, we take road trips. We've been to Cincinnati, but we've taken them now to about 15 major league stadiums over the last several years. We were, shut out of doing that over COVID, but looking forward to making up some ballparks this coming summer.
What a great plan. So my daughter Audrey, who happens to be on this call right now, hopefully remembers this story. I was trying to get my two daughters engaged in baseball, and so I took Audrey to Cincinnati when she was like 6 or 7. And back then you could maneuver around enough where I got seats on Sunday. We went to a Saturday-Sunday game. I got seats right on the dugout for the Sunday game. And Benito Santiago, who was the catcher for the Reds, threw Audrey a baseball. So we had but I mean, it was a beautiful day, really nice. We had this baseball. We get in the car with it's just Audrey and I, and we're driving back. And I go, "What did you think?" And she goes, "I really like that." And I said, "That's great." And I said, "Do you want to come back next year?" And she goes, "No, I've done that now."
Wow. It reminds me, my dad has a story that he tells. He grew up, as I mentioned, in Wisconsin. For his 8th birthday, I think it was, he got a Milwaukee Braves signed baseball for his birthday, and stupidly used the ball in a game with his friends. And the park in Madison was right next to the Vilas Park Zoo. And one of his friends hit the ball into Winky the elephant's cage, and Winky the elephant chewed up a Milwaukee Braves baseball that had Hank Aaron and Warren Spahn and Eddie Matthews' signature on it, and spit it out in front of him.
Good for Winky the elephant.
Yeah.
So we're going to go on for this. I know we got to start, but we're just telling baseball stories at this point. My dad, who was died many years ago, told us the story that his mother was a judge, okay, in Boston. And the story goes is that Babe Ruth committed some type of misdemeanor or something and ended up in front of my grandmother, okay, on whatever the count was. And I don't know what she did I don't know if any of this is true, but this is the story. Whatever she did, she, community served or whatever, but she got a baseball signed by him, okay, and gave it to my dad. And at that point, back in the late 30s, early 40s, whatever, you didn't have a lot of baseballs flying around. So he came up with the idea of using some type of masking tape or black electrical tape, and he wrapped up the ball, and then they went outside and played with it. And then whenever they brought it back in, the autograph came off with the tape.
Oh my gosh.
Anyway, that's his story. I'm sticking to it. All right.
Yeah, it sounds about as legally believable as the Winky the Elephant story. So
I love Winky the Elephant. I think that's great. Ladies and gentlemen, Andrew Maraniss is our guest today. He is the author of Strong Inside. It was the story about Percy Wallace. And we're really glad you're here. You also, what's your official title at Vanderbilt in the athletic department?
Director of Special Projects in the athletic department at Vanderbilt.
Okay. So if you all have a special project you want to do within Vanderbilt athletics, talk to Andrew. He's your man. Councilmember Rutherford is on. Councilmember Hauser is on. Welcome. Let's go ahead and start. So, Andrew, tell me a little bit about yourself. I know you were born in Milwaukee. I've always heard that there are 3 taps on the sink. There's a hot water, a cold water, and a beer tap.
Right.
But is that true? Tell me a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, I can verify that. It's true.
Okay.
Actually, I was born in Madison, but it's true there too. My parents were students at the University of Wisconsin when I was born. We moved pretty quickly to the East Coast. My dad was moving to different newspapers, so we were sort of following his career, first to New Jersey and then to Washington, D.C., which is where I really grew up until sophomore year of high school. We moved to Austin, Texas. So I went to high school at Austin High and ended up coming to Nashville through a scholarship. Hello. To Vanderbilt. There was a poster on the wall advertising the Fred Russell. I'm sure many of you people on the call remember Mr. Russell, Grantland Rice sports writing scholarship at Vanderbilt. And so I applied for that and was lucky enough to win that. And so that's how I came here. I'm sort of back at my first employer. So after I graduated, I was the publicist for the Vanderbilt basketball team for 5 years, moved to Tampa. Speaking of our baseball conversation, I was the media relations manager for the Tampa Bay Rays during their first season, which was the 98 season. Players like Wade Boggs and Fred McGriff were on that team. And I came back to Nashville and was at McNeely, Piggott and Fox public relations for 17 years. Have been back at Vandy for about 5 years now, but also have this sort of second life as an author. You mentioned Strong Inside. So that was initially, it was a paper I wrote about Perry when I was a history student at Vanderbilt. Came back, wrote that book, then adapted that book for middle school kids. Have written 2 books for young adults since then, one on the first U.S. Olympic men's basketball team, which played at the 1936 Olympics in Nazi Germany. So obviously Strong Inside, more about civil rights and racism than basketball. Second book about fascism and anti-Semitism. And my third book came out last year. It's called Singled Out. It's a biography of Glenn Burke, who was the first openly gay Major League Baseball player and the inventor of the high five. And then I've just written a book that'll come out in September called Inaugural Ballers, which is a story of the first US women's Olympic basketball team at the 76 Olympics in Montreal. So I've got a family. I mentioned an 11-year-old daughter, 8-year-old son there at St. Bernard's. My wife, Allison, grew up here in Nashville. She works at the Burgundy Group, which is a small advertising agency. And then I'm at Vandy. So we just got a puppy this past weekend, which has been a life changer for us, good and bad ways, I guess you could say. But no, thank you for having me on. I'm excited to talk about whatever you want to discuss.
Well, so one of the questions we got over the week was, how is the puppy?
Yeah, his name is Kendall. He came from a humane society in Blytheville, Arkansas. So my son and I drove to Arkansas last weekend, picked him up. He's a really loving and sweet dog, but is experiencing a lot of separation anxiety right now, which we're dealing with the best we can. If anybody on this Zoom has any experience or tips with that, it's driving us nuts, I guess you could say. No one's getting any sleep and no one can leave the room without the dog going berserk. But we went to the vet this morning, got some tips, and so hopefully that'll start to improve here soon. But we were happy to get him out of that situation. It was a pretty bleak place he was living in before.
Well, I'm glad things seem to be getting better. That's good. Well, tell me, and that's my granddaughter making noise back there.
That's great.
I think she really wants to be on this call.
Yeah, I'll let her in.
Yeah, well, anyway, she's now gone someplace else. So tell me what it was like. Well, obviously you wrote the story about Perry Wallace. You wrote something for it when you were in college, right? Mm-hmm. And then this morphed into a book. Obviously you have a passion for this. What made you want to do it? I think your dad was an author, is that right?
That's right.
So your dad was an author, and you started writing as well. What made you decide to do the Perry Wallace book, and then what was it like doing it? What was Perry Wallace like?
Well, when I wrote the paper about him, just, I didn't go to grad school. I was an undergraduate course at Vanderbilt on Black history, and I had never heard the name Perry Wallace before until I read an article in the student newspaper, The Hustler, and it talked about the fact that he was the Jackie Robinson of the SEC, first Black player in the SEC, and that he was coming back to campus for the first time to be recognized for the history that he made. And it was 19 years after he graduated. And so that article was in the paper at the same time I was taking this class. And so it seemed like something I'd be interested in writing about. And I called Perry. I lived in Tower 3, one of the towers that's been imploded, recently. And he was a professor at the University of Baltimore Law School at the time. And I just called him out of the blue, and he spent 2 hours telling me about his life that night when I was 19. And so I wrote this paper. It stuck with me as the most interesting thing that I thought that I did the entire time I was in school. And it was not until 17 years later, though, that I really sort of thought, as you mentioned, my dad's written a number of books, and I sort of avoided it, even though I love writing, because I didn't really want to try to follow in his footsteps or try to compete with my dad. I knew I couldn't write as well as him. So I had a little bit of hesitation in trying to do it. But finally, I thought Perry's story is so interesting. He is such a brilliant person. It would be a crime if he just lived and died and no one knew his story. Someone should write a book about him. And then finally I was like, well, why not me? And so I emailed Perry, asked if he remembered the paper I had written about him. He said yes. I don't know if he really did or not, but he said yes. And so I didn't have to ask for his permission, but I wanted to make sure he would cooperate if I was working on a book. And he said yes, he would do the interviews, introduce me to his family, share pictures and documents. And I just felt like my interest in sports is about the games like anyone else, but it's also about human interest stories and the way that it illuminates aspects of society and culture and politics. And I thought there was so much to in that regard in telling Perry's story. Growing up in Nashville, he did in the 1950s and 60s in segregation, and then he starts high school at Pearl High a week after Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. He's in high school during the passage of the Voting Rights Act and Civil Rights Act. He saw the lunch counter sit-ins down on Fifth Avenue, like with his own eyes. You walk downtown to see that. So you could tell so much about Nashville history and American history through Perry's story. And then the idea that he, as a teenager, 18, 19-year-old kid, is the first Black player ever to play at Mississippi State, and all the other SEC schools. And the hate that he was experiencing in those moments is one aspect of the racism he encountered. But then the other part that he said was actually worse was the isolation and the loneliness he felt on his own campus, same school that I was going to, 20 years later. And so I felt really personally interested and invested in his story. And Perry, for those of you who knew him, he was such a wise man and had the ability to step outside of himself and really observe himself, in the way that he was operating in these spaces, and could explain that in ways that were so compelling and easy for everyone to understand. And that's what I found interesting about having an adult version of his book and then writing a middle school version of his book, which I've actually spoken about with kids as young as the 4th grade lunch book club at Waverly Belmont Elementary School, read that book. And so I would visit with them. And the questions from the kids to, anyone of any age who read the adult book were really similar, and people were relating to Perry's story in just real basic human ways. And I felt that he had such an ability to take this big issue of racism and discrimination and hate and boil it down to a person's life that really resonated with people.
So tell me, as you're, with the writing of the book, with what Perry Wallace was interested in, what you're trying to do, particularly with the 8th grade, or getting it down to a more of a middle school level and even younger, does it resonate? Do you feel like your books are, do kids have a chance to kind of see that, they can work through adversity and be successful, and there's different ways to do it, that type of thing?
Yeah, that's been incredibly rewarding for me. That's the reason why I don't write strictly for adults anymore, is because the ability to go into a school and, one piece of my books, they all have a sports aspect to them, even though they're really about bigger issues than that. But I think the sports piece makes them accessible, especially to kids who might not ordinarily spend much time in the library, or who love to play a sport, whether in real life or on a video game, or watch sports on TV. They're not intimidated by a book that has a picture of a basketball player or a baseball player on the cover. And so maybe they'll pick it up. And so I've been to 25 states now at schools talking about Perry Wallace, which is really fun for me. But I love it when a kid who the librarian will say, this kid hasn't really read that much, but they really got into this book. So that is one level of inspiration, I guess you could say, kids are taking just in hopefully becoming lifelong readers for this. But yes, there's classes that have done projects on asking the students to write an essay about how they've been strong inside in their own life, and so those have been really touching stories that I've read. Or they'll relate to the notion of empathy that is one of the themes of the book, and the lack of empathy that Perry experienced from a lot of people around him when he was at Vanderbilt. And so that's a message that I hope will come across to students. And I know we're going to talk about this later, but one of the dangers in these book bans that we're seeing is how they cut off learning about the experience of other people and developing that empathy, or they remove the opportunity for students to read about people like themselves, when there's this assumption that when legislators are talking about parents, they're only talking about white parents, or how is a white kid's feelings going to be hurt by reading about true history, and lack of acknowledgement that there's a lot of kids who are relating to the Black character in the story, you know, or the Latinos character in the story. And so it's been interesting for me to see how different students from different circumstances relate to the book. I spoke at an event in Manhattan that was a group of Black and Latino high school boys who gather weekly on different projects. And so they all read the book and they related to Perry's experience, seeing themselves in a lot of aspects of this story. I also spoke at a high school in the middle of a dairy farm in Wisconsin. There were no Black kids at that school, but that's one of the places where I had two kids come up and say like that they didn't ordinarily like to read, but they wanted to read about basketball. And so they were introduced to a whole story about civil rights that they had no connection to, but were exposed to it and really enjoyed it.
I mean, I'm thinking this is really interesting from the standpoint of it's a with so many issues flying around in the country, in our city, that we can't seem to find something that we can all kind of understand from. And it does make me nervous when books are pulled off the shelf, because in many ways people and young people can relate to stories in those books and need to understand, you know, things that have happened, and because we don't want certain things to happen ever again. So I love what you're doing with the book. I think that's great. And I like the idea that it's connecting kids who might not normally read, but see it as an initial sports book, or picking up and learning from something. Have you ever talked to a college basketball team before?
Yes, I have. So, you know, working at Vanderbilt, I've spoken with the Vanderbilt basketball team a couple of times, you know, as new players come in. Coach Stackhouse has had me talk to his team. Bryce Drew did earlier when he was the coach. The University of Wisconsin basketball team invited me to speak to them. They had a player named Bronson Koenig, who's Native American and was involved in the pipeline protests. Another player named Nigel Hayes, a Black player who was, you know, speaking out against racism in the country. And so the coach thought that they would like to hear Perry's story. And I'm from Wisconsin, you know, so that was an opportunity I really loved. Spoken with student athletes, not just basketball, but a number of them at Belmont had me over. The coach at Arkansas invited me to speak to him and some of his coaches when I was in Arkansas anyway for a book festival. Murray State. So if anyone knows Ja Morant, who's one of the stars in the NBA right now, they had a history department lecture, and their coach asked their entire basketball team to come. And so I got to meet Ja Morant and speak to them. That's been great, you know, and whether it's basketball teams or just other college students, and I've spoken to, you know, to regular students at a number of colleges too. One of the things that's interesting and yet revealing and disappointing is that a lot of the students can relate to aspects of what Perry was going through in the late 60s at Vanderbilt in terms of this feeling of isolation on their own campus, or that this campus exists for other people and they should feel lucky to be there, you know, as a scholarship basketball player or as a Black student at a predominantly white school, you know. And so there'll be really interesting discussions that are generated when they read about Perry's experience with that aspect of his pioneering career. It wasn't just pioneering on the basketball court, it was pioneering on the campus. And those experiences that he had are pretty similar to what many students are going through now.
Well, I'm making some notes because I think it's so interesting what you're doing and what you're being able to do with what you're writing about. You may or may not know this, but my brother's the head coach of the University of Alabama, Huntsville. And he's been there for 3 years. And I think he has tried in the past to bring in interesting speakers to talk about different issues. And the way I look at this, and some people have heard this, what I've talked to him about and what I think about in terms of many organizations and entities, he's got you know, young people who come into his program, and he's got them for, you know, 2, 3, 4 years, depends on, hopefully they stay in school. And I've always said he's got a limited amount of time to also teach them, not just basketball, but other things. And I think he understands that he's got some responsibility in all this as well. And so do these other basketball coaches or baseball coaches or anybody else.
Some people may have heard on this call of Bill Curry, who was the head coach at Alabama, Kentucky, Georgia Tech, played for the Packers. And he's really interesting. I would recommend following him on Twitter if anybody's on Twitter, but talking about racism and sports and the role that coaches have in bringing their players together. And I think sometimes sports, like, people have an overly rosy thought that, like, the great thing about sports is it brings people together. Well, sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, but in the best sense, what Coach Curry says is that when you're in the locker room, everybody's sweat smells the same. That's what he says, and that for him personally, growing up in Atlanta, thinking one way about Black people, when he got to the Green Bay Packers and had these amazing teammates who became Hall of Famers or were just great men, that he understood that what he had been brought up with was completely wrong, and that's what changed his life, was being in the huddle, being in the locker room with these men. And so there are those opportunities for coaches and for teams to be working together for a common goal, people from all walks of life, that you hope would be the model for the rest of society, and in some ways, that's one of the surprising things that these basketball players, when I talk to them about Perry's story or they read the book, what they see and what they're really disappointed in is that Perry didn't receive more support from his own teammates at Vandy. And so I'll tell a quick story. So Perry becomes the first Black player ever to play a game at Ole Miss his sophomore year, because his freshman year, University of Mississippi canceled both of its games against Vanderbilt rather than play against a team that had Black players on it. So Perry's sophomore year, he goes down there, and first half of the game, he gets elbowed in the face on purpose. He's bleeding. The refs don't call a foul. One of the team trainers, student manager who I interviewed, said he walked Perry across the court to the locker room, and the crowd was cheering the fact that Perry was injured. But Perry told me that wasn't the most difficult part of that whole experience. It was what happened at halftime, where he's sitting on the training table with a bag of ice on his face, and the clock is ticking down to let the team know it's time to go back on the court for the second half. And all of his teammates, all the coaches, all the trainers and managers ran back on the court like it was any other game. And they left Perry on the training table by himself. And he knew he was going to have to walk back through that tunnel out onto the court where this crowd has been harassing him the whole first half by himself. And that if his teammates had put themselves in his shoes just for a minute, and shown some degree of empathy, that at least one of them would have walked back on the court with Perry, and shown the crowd that they had their teammates back. And that didn't happen. And so he understood at that moment that he was in this by himself, alone. And so you can see that as a single example of a basketball player and his teammates. You could look at that as a broader issue of, allyship and, like, are you really in it or not? And oftentimes people feel like they've been left hanging. And so Perry was able to relay that story through his experience in Oxford, Mississippi.
An amazing story. Amazing. I did need to note that when I was talking about your dad, he won a Pulitzer Prize, correct?
He did.
Yeah. Yes.
He run it for he works for the Washington Post, and he wrote a series of biographical articles on Bill Clinton as he was running for president. And so that series won a Pulitzer. And then he was part of another one when part of a team for the Virginia Tech shootings, the stories that posted about that. He dropped his Pulitzer on the floor. My dad's like anyone else's, or most people, many people's dad's, kind of a great writer, right? But a little bit clueless in other areas, right? So he's the guy that, like, wins a Pulitzer and drops it on the floor. It's like a crystal, intricately shaped thing. It has a chunk broken out of it.
No. Well, let's just put it, makes it much more valuable.
That's right.
It's a little unique and different from everybody else's. Okay. Well, so I want to get into Mouse and the book banning, but a couple more questions about how do you select your projects? Because one of the projects, as soon as you started talking about stuff, obviously the Olympics started, yesterday officially. What was interesting about the Olympics was, at least yesterday when Today's Show was showing it live, I believe, in the morning, was that the first person they started they had questions for was the political people, because Putin had shown up. There's all this kind of this turmoil going on in the world, and we've got the Olympics, which are supposed to promote peace. So you've obviously written about the Olympics, and you wrote something about Jesse Owens, right?
Yeah. So my second book, it's not about Jesse Owens, but it's about the Olympics where he became famous, the 36 Olympics. So I was at the University of Kansas to speak about Strong Inside. And while I was there, I really wanted to see Allen Fieldhouse, where the Jayhawks play basketball. And so they have a really great museum all about Kansas basketball there. And Kansas, like Duke or North Carolina or Kentucky, they all feel like they're the home of college basketball, right? So they won a bidding war at an auction to hold James Naismith original rules of basketball from 1892 when he invented basketball. And so those are there under glass, kind of like the Constitution at the National Archives or something, And so I was on this tour and saw those original rules. And right next to it, they had a picture of Naismith with a Japanese basketball player during the 1930s. And I asked about that picture, and they explained that the inventor of the game saw his invention played in the Olympics for the first time, which I had never knew. And so I said, well, which Olympics was that? And they said it was the 1936 Olympics in Nazi Germany. And so that you asked about how I get the idea. I was standing there at Allen Fieldhouse looking at that picture and those rules. And there's been so much written about the 36 Olympics, but I didn't feel that even sports fans really understood that's where basketball debuted in the Olympics. And so got started and spent a year and a half working on that book and using basketball as again as a way to tell a larger story. And students in middle school and high school read a lot about the Holocaust or World War II. They don't necessarily read about those years leading up to it, and so this was a way to write about the early 30s in Germany, some parallels between what was happening there and what was happening in the United States at that time, plus just an interesting piece of basketball history, the invention of the game, because I was able to take that with Naismith and carry him all the way through being there as an old man to see his game played at the Olympics. How the US team was formed was really interesting. Half the players worked on the movie sets at Universal Studios, where they happened to have a company basketball team, and they were one of the best teams in the country. And so they represented the United States in Berlin at those Olympics. When I was traveling around to schools telling that story, a lot of students would ask me, what was the first women's basketball team at the Olympics? Which wasn't until 40 years later, 1976. And so when I started to think, well, 1976, that's the 70s, that's Title IX, ERA. You could work in a story about this first women's basketball team into what was happening in American politics, culture at that time. And so that's the book I've written that comes out later this year. The one I didn't mention was Singled Out, which is the story of Glenn Burke, the first openly gay Major League Baseball player. That was just in a discussion with my literary agent. We were talking about various ideas that involve sports and social issues. And he mentioned Glenn Burke's name. And I remembered that I had his baseball card when I was 8 years old. I can picture it in my mind in his road Dodgers uniform, a gray uniform, and I knew that he had been considered the first gay player and had invented the high five. I knew nothing else about his story, but placing his story in the context of gay rights movement of the 1970s and the backlash to it. And then Glenn dies of AIDS. And I didn't feel that many middle school and high school kids really have a sense of AIDS epidemic. Or I also did feel like, though, that they were ready to hear the story of a gay pioneer in sports, which, if I'm thinking honestly about my own middle school experience, I don't know. There were definitely kids that would have wanted that story, but I don't think that they felt comfortable at my middle school or high school saying so, or that a straight kid like me on the baseball team would necessarily feel comfortable carrying that book around school without, getting picked on or something. So I had noticed a real change for the better in these school environments that I was in. And I thought, this is a story that I think would be really well received in schools right now. And it has been. But then you see what's happening, like talk about these book bans. I've written books about racism, anti-Semitism, fascism, homophobia. Those are all the types of books that they're trying to eliminate, which have been increasingly popular types of books in schools. I mean, it's no coincidence that they're trying to ban them when these are what people are reading, and I'm so proud of the librarians that we've seen that have stood up against what's happening, teachers, parents, students, who are really benefiting from these books, that they're actually reading real world books about real world issues. And I just don't think it's a coincidence that people who don't want people thinking about history or getting engaged in social action or politics, trying to keep those books out of the hands of kids.
So what do you, I don't know the full story behind Big Bend County. I don't know what they were. I know what I read. Okay. And so some people would argue and say, yeah, if there's, whatever obscenities, pictures, whatever, maybe that's too young for people, but these were 8th graders you're talking about. And my guess is they read a whole lot worse.
Right.
How do we deal with this? I mean, from your perspective as an author, how do we promote reading and don't take it out of kids' hands?
Yeah. I mean, it's a really important question right now. One thing I would say is not to take anything at face value in terms of the arguments that people are using against these books. And in my mind, the argument that any conservative person, quote unquote conservative person, uses on any issue right now, there's hypocrisy in every argument out there. So, for example, yesterday, this idea of legitimate political discourse at the Capitol insurrection, that's legitimate, conversation, discourse, rhetoric. How could any book not be, right? How could you argue that any book should be taken out of a school? Obscenities, look at the last president, that these same people would have supported. So, I mean, I wouldn't take any of the arguments at face value, first of all. Second, I think that teachers and librarians, principals, in my mind, seem to all be on the correct side of this issue. They're not the ones asking for these books to be removed. And so they need to be supported and heard from parents who do want these types of books in schools and understand the value that they have. I think sometimes even I'll say, like, you see these, what's happening. I live in Williamson County now, and so these Williamson Moms for Liberty or whatever. You write them off as crazy people, right? Have a way to go, right? Speaking up louder and not allowing these movements to grow any further than they have is what we have to do.
Well, so, and one of the questions I would ask, because obviously as being in politics for the last number of years, you try to get your points across, and you get pushback, and then you get into this, we get some people who have these extreme beliefs, and then they just lock down. And so arguing with them doesn't seem to work. No. So how do you push forth? I mean, I love the concept of, we want people to read. We want young people to read. That's how they learn. And they need to understand, and they need to understand the Holocaust.
Absolutely.
So it's like we're pushing back. And is that the argument that you make? You can't, I mean, sometimes you can't, sometimes the other side is just not embellished in the truth.
Right.
So,
yeah, no, I think that's what makes it so hard, is you're not appealing. It seems impossible to appeal to truth in winning that argument. I don't know. I mean, but I do think that maybe more time and attention needs to be paid to, rather than trying to, sorry, my son is wandering around here, change the minds of those people, is to build even larger the base of the other side, and to speak to those who are in favor of the truth and true history being taught, and the value of public schools, value of education, so that it becomes such a larger, constituency that the other side has no chance to win these battles. But I don't know. I mean, that's what's so discouraging about living in Williamson County is I feel like my vote is irrelevant in some ways, but you can't give up, right? Or living in Tennessee. But I think things change. I mean, this has been a blue state before. And so what else are you going to do? I mean, I think that's one thing that Perry Wallace would advise me is keep going. What's the alternative? But to fight for what is true and what is just, and to try to move everyone forward just a little bit. He would say, not everyone is a superhero. And in the 60s, he said there would be some people who would be disappointed in others who weren't at the front of every protest, or didn't, voice their opinion the loudest in every situation. And he said, that's just not realistic. Not everyone is going to put themselves in that position, but take people where they are and try to move them forward as much as possible, and to accept those victories, move on to other people, And so I think there may be small bites and everyone doing their part, not throwing up their arms and saying like, this whole thing is so big and unwinnable, like I'm not going to do anything. Like you can do things within your own family. So we have 2 kids, we're very conscientious about the types of books that they're reading, supporting the librarians and the teachers at the school that they go to, being involved as a parent in that community, supporting our library, so there, I guess, like everyone says, politics is local, right? And so start in the smallest environments you can, and then make sure those are strong, build out bigger and bigger from there.
I think you're on track. Big, giant issues all floating around, and you can't solve them in one fell swoop. I think it takes everybody kind of understanding one another and then working in small segments to get to where you want to get to. Tell me, I had a question about, I guess, well, go back to other books that have been banned. Besides this one, it seems like other ones are being banned at this point. Any coincidence to this stuff? Does it seem like it's now going to start happening again? Or is this just kind of did something cause this to happen around, particularly around mouse?
Well, I mean, I think there's been stories about how these what appear to be grassroots efforts, are not, and they're funded by wealthy Republican donors and their supporters, right? And so I don't think there's any coincidence, coordinated national effort, just like a lot of legislation you see that's exactly the same from one state to another, or sometimes they forget to take out the name of the state, so I don't think that these efforts are going away, or it was just one person's idea, in one municipality. Seems to me to be connected to voter suppression and other elements of trying to control politics, society, education. I mean, to me, it seems like Joy Reid posted today, we don't have to wonder what fascism will look like when it arrives, like it's already here. And you could say, well, throughout history, we've seen different pieces of it already here for a long time. But it seems like, I mean, as a parent right now, it's scary times for me. And I see the book bans as connected to all those other aspects of rising fascism throughout society.
You ever see, you see the movie Field of Dreams?
Yes.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite movies. I've only watched it about 1,000 times. The scene where Amy Madigan is up there and they're talking about book banning. Yeah. Is a wonderful scene. It gets cut off because he has to drag her out because he's got to go to Boston or something. And to save Terrence Mann. But the argument that she makes is, to me, the right argument, which is, don't we love the Constitution, and don't we love America? That's what we were founded on, was the freedom to do things. I mean, what do you say to that? I mean,
Yeah,
because
absolutely. I mean, that's again where I'm saying, don't take any arguments at face value. Stuart Stevens, the former Republican operative, will say, it was all a lie. Joe Engel, the great minister here in Nashville, told me, what you have to remember is that everything you think you know about American history is wrong. So I think these are all sort of connected. And so the other side typically is the one wearing the lapel pin, on their suit and waving the flag around, and yet is the one that is acting in the most un-American ways. Perry Wallace told me that when he observed himself in these situations, say in Oxford, Mississippi, he said the people that were screaming epithets at him and threatening to kill him after the game probably would have considered themselves in Mississippi to be good Christians, right? Would have been considered themselves to be good Americans, and yet they were betraying the most fundamental beliefs they had about themselves. He saw right through that hypocrisy and called it out as 18, 19, 20-year-old kid. And then 40 years later, when I was interviewing him for the book. And so you're right. My grandfather was blacklisted in the McCarthy days as a communist. He was interested in leftist politics back in the 40s and the 30s because of racism. He wanted to fight racism. And those were the people where he found that were sort of involved in that. But he fought for the United States in the Army in the Pacific in World War II. When he passed away, he didn't know that you're not supposed to be buried with the American flag, but he wanted to. He was what I would call like a progressive patriot. He saw the flaws in this country, but he loved the country and he wanted to make it better. I don't think there's any doubt that when you're talking about people who are interested in like fighting for voting rights or for true history to be taught or against culture built on lies, that is patriotism. And yet it's branded as the opposite of that. And, everything's topsy-turvy, upside down.
It is topsy-turvy. You feel it all the time. And for some reason, I started worrying about it even more this week because I just, with stuff going on in Ukraine and with the pandemic and then with the book banning and other stuff, it just seems like can't seem to turn it back so that we're trying to do things better and trying to make people communicate more and get things righted. And I don't see that right now.
Yeah.
And I worry a lot about that.
Me too. I guess we can look and see that like there's always been sort of a battle for people to fight. Like you would hope, like, can we just get over these problems, but that's not going to happen. So every generation has their own, battle ahead of them. And the good news is that actually we're in the majority. Sometimes it doesn't feel like it, or depending where you live, it might not literally be true in your county or your state, but as a country, we are. I'm waiting for, and I've been disappointed that companies who claim in some ways that they are people, right, are not acting as good citizens. Universities, where's the voices of the universities in this? Are corporations and universities just happy to sort of slide into this loss of democracy by playing it safe, playing it down the middle, or are they going to take a stand, in support of people and basic, things that we supposedly believe in?
Let me ask you a question. Just came in about Brian Flores out of suing the NFL. I was busy towards the end of the week. I heard a little bit of sports radio, and some people were applauding that decision. What do you think? I mean, have you looked at it enough to kind of know he's making a point?
I mean, and he's being very brave in making this point, and I can relate this back to Perry Wallace also. But there's a good chance that Brian Flores, for those who don't know, he's suing the NFL, alleging discrimination and being a Black coach. He's been denied opportunities, and that the opportunities in many interviews that he has had have been shams. The teams have already known who they were going to hire, and will bring him in for an interview just to show that they interviewed a Black candidate under what's called the Rooney Rule in the NFL, where they're required to. But as a young coach suing the NFL, what are his prospects of ever getting hired again? He's certainly likely diminishing those prospects. Right now in the NFL hiring cycle, I think there are 9 coaching vacancies. 70% of the NFL is Black. None of those 9 spots have been filled by a Black coach yet. And none of them maybe. And so what I relate the courage that Brian Flores had in speaking his mind, telling the truth about his experiences, exactly back to Perry, who the day after his last game at Vanderbilt gave an interview with the Tennessean where he talked about the racism he had experienced for 4 years as a pioneer in the SEC. Story ran on the front page of the paper. People called the Tennessean to cancel their subscriptions. White people called Vanderbilt Athletic Department to cancel their season tickets, said that Perry was ungrateful, and ran him out of town. And it wasn't until 19 years later, when I happened to be a sophomore, that coincidentally is the first time he's ever invited back to campus, because people didn't want to hear the truth from him. Finally, the people had changed and they said, let's invite him back. He's a significant figure. So I imagine same type of thing will happen with Flores, which is the same type of thing which happened with Muhammad Ali, Colin Kaepernick, where people are, they tell the truth and they're blackballed in the moment. And it's not until decades later that a larger part of white society is willing to really just level with the truth of what was trying to be told the whole time, and then embraces these people as truth tellers when they could have been there to support them in the moment.
You got people who are obviously willing to step out and step up, who are willing to take that type of or get into that type of situation to make a point that needs to be made. So it'll be interesting to watch how this works, and you may be right. But I think about Perry Wallace and what he endured, and what he, even as he endured it,
That's
and
right.
a message came up about Kurt Flood.
Kurt Flood
doing that?
cost himself a career in baseball, fighting for free agency that has benefited every baseball player since him, but it cost him his career.
Well, so there's a follow-up question that was asked before the Kurt Flood reference, and that is 50 years from now, with particularly within sports, and the level of the amount of money that are paid, coaches, players, now college kids can get involved. What do you see happening? I mean, I don't think this can go up for, I guess it can for too much longer, but you're going to price everybody out of the market in terms of nobody will be able to watch the games or go to the games. They can watch it on television. It's almost like it's out of control. You see anything happening to try to get that thing wrestled back?
Yeah, I'm reading the question here. What will history say 50 years from now about the minority athletes' experience in sports today, especially in this era of excessive coaching salaries and the revenue athletes bring into their schools? So, really looking at college athletics, I think 50 years from now, there will be a completely different model in place, and that the model that we have been accustomed to over the last 50 plus years will look archaic. You're starting to see some changes now, at least a greater acknowledgement that things are out of whack, and that it's primarily African-American labor that is not being compensated, while white coaches and athletic directors are making millions and millions of dollars. And so the acknowledgement that that's not right. So the first thing you've seen is this name, image, likeness legislation that finally allows college athletes to profit off of who they are. They're signing sponsorship deals just like a professional athlete would. Some schools, you have companies that are paying like the entire offensive line at a school in Texas $25,000 a year to be able to use them in their promotions and advertisements. So athletes are being compensated in that way. That still doesn't address what's happening with the revenue that they're generating for their universities, or the large TV deals that the major conferences have that the players are not benefiting from. And so I think that 50 years from now, that will be completely different. But what you might see is that college sports doesn't exist in the same way it does now, where, you're given a scholarship, you're actually a student at that university, and whatever money is brought in, is shared with the students. It might be almost a licensing agreement that a school will have. And this football team is called the Vanderbilt Commodores or Tennessee Volunteers or whoever. but there might not be the same relationship between those players as students at the university. They could have functioned more like a minor league team that's branded with a college name. This is also the 50th anniversary of Title IX this year, which is the reason why my women's basketball book is coming out this year. And so there are questions about the correct model for women's sports also, but some people will say, well, if football players are bringing in this money, they should be the ones to benefit from that money. Why should a women's sport that's not bringing in women's cross country teams not making millions of dollars like the football team is, yet right now money from the football team is supporting those scholarships on the women's side. So there are people on both sides of those issues also. It's very interesting, complex questions that are out there. But I mean, I think, as the poster says, I mean, it's a little bit obscene right now to have, or maybe more than a little bit, coaches making millions, the players making nothing. And I don't think that's going to last much longer.
It's going to be very interesting to kind of see how it morphs out. We've got about 3 minutes left, so I've got 2 more questions for you. All right. First of all, the basketball game that I most remember, besides the ones that I attended, but the one that I most remember is the 1972 Olympic finals. Yes. Okay. And has anybody, I don't know, has anybody ever written a book on that? And for those of you who aren't that old, the 1972 Olympics was the first game the Americans ever lost in basketball. It was in the finals. They lost to the Russians. And it took 3 possessions with 1 point something seconds left to determine the game. They kept having to replay it. In the end, the Russians finally hit a basket. Anybody ever written a book on that? Because
I have not seen a book about it. Yeah, I mean, there's books about those Munich Olympics, but not specifically about the experience of the men's team, as far as I know. Though I know the players on the American team have, to this day, never accepted their silver medals, feeling that they were, that whole end of the game was a sham. That the head of the FIBA, which is the international organizing body for basketball, said the Americans were essentially bad losers, but yeah, and so that whole Cold War aspect of sports and basketball is really interesting to me, and I do explore it in my women's basketball book because they're coming along at the next Olympics in Montreal, and so there still was great tension between the Soviet and American basketball camps on the men's side and the women's side. American women were not considered very good. They had not even qualified for the Olympics until the last minute in a qualifying tournament for the last 2 teams to be invited to the Olympics. Soviets by far dominated women's basketball at that time. They had a center who was 7'2" and was unstoppable. Americans won the silver medal in their first Olympic experience. Were over the moon to even get the silver medal. There's a Tennessee aspect. Pat Head, future Pat Summitt, was a player on that first women's Olympic basketball team. And they have not lost the silver medal or the gold medal but once since then. I think the American women have won 7 or 8 straight gold medals, haven't even lost a game. So it's the most dominant program in any team sport in the world right now is the American women's basketball team.
Well, we'll see that in Paris in 2024.
That's right.
Well, I remember those Olympics. I remember how horrible those things. And I had a chance, as we end up this conversation, I had a chance to meet Jim McKay. The ABC announcer came to East Tennessee State University, and I was, all of 13 or 14, but those a lot of those images are embedded in my memory, just the whole thing. Okay, so we're going to end by obviously one of a former Vanderbilt basketball player is being honored tonight at Vanderbilt at the halftime of the game. Vanderbilt plays LSU tonight at 5 p.m. LSU is 25th in the nation. But Shane Foster is being recognized and his jersey is being retired. Just quickly, as we end this program, tell us what's happening tonight.
Yeah, so Shane Foster, many of you know his work with the YWCA here at Nashville, but he's also Vanderbilt's all-time leading scorer. You talked about your favorite basketball game is that 72, or the most memorable to you. most memorable to me was Shane Foster's senior night, his last game at Memorial Gym against Mississippi State. He scored 42 points, made 9 straight 3-pointers, including the game winner in overtime. But obviously, one of the best players in Vanderbilt basketball history. He's a really good person doing important work in Nashville. So at halftime of the game, his jersey will be retired. He'll be up there in the rafters with Perry Wallace and with Clyde Lee, the only 3 Vandy men's basketball players who have had their jerseys retired. And then I know after that ceremony that the GMU and the Metro Council have done a resolution in Shane's honor, and he'll be presented with that as well. So it'll be a great night for Shane. I know he has 20 or 30 family members. He's from Louisiana, so that's why it's during the LSU game that he's being honored. They are all coming up from Kenner, Louisiana to support Shane. Just a really good man. I'm happy to see him honored tonight.
And I think he's signing books beforehand, maybe at the bookstore.
Yeah,
right?
at 3:00 at the Vanderbilt bookstore, the old Barnes and Noble right there on the corner at West End, signing copies of his memoir. So I encourage people to stop by there before the game if they're headed over.
Yeah, great. Andrew Maraniss, thank you very much. This has been so interesting. So appreciate your comments. I got Avi Poster said I should talk about my athletic experiences. That would just take way too long. It'd take you a lot more than an hour and a half of me trying to think of what it was. Yeah. So Andrew, thank you. Let's see, next week, our guest is going to be CJ Sentel from the Nashville Food Project. Everybody watch the game tonight. Be thinking about Shane Foster and all the great stuff he has done and he is doing right now. And it'll be fun tonight to watch. And anyway, thank you for being our guest. Everybody have a nice, safe weekend. We'll see you next week.
Thanks,
everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Werner, I think I